in 1866, Lord Carnarvon was one of life's mavericks. He sailed around the world at 21. He was a keen shot, a gambler, breeder of racehorses, photographer, and lover of fast cars. But it was his adventures in Egypt that captivated the world, and where he made one of the most dazzling discoveries of all time. Carnarvon's tale is of adventure and determination, moments of triumph and great tragedy. His is the tale of the search for Tutankhamun. In a completely unique journey, I joined his great-grandson, the current Lord Carnarvon, and his wife as they travelled around Egypt to retrace these adventures. We began in Luxor, where I asked the current Earl how his great-grandfather became involved in Egyptology in the first place.
He really got involved in Egyptology when he was somewhat older, having had fairly serious car smashes.
Is that because he is quite a wild driver?
Well, I think he must have been, really. I mean, they seem to be on the continent, or in both cases. But one of them, while driving in Germany, he turned the whole vehicle over and broke his ribs and was lucky to survive at all. And of course, if you break your ribs, you can damage lungs and the rest. And he was strongly advised by doctors not to spend the cold, damp winters in England, because he would probably succumb to pneumonia. So he came out here to Egypt, found his way to the Nile and the Winter Palace at Luxor, and again wasn't someone for sitting around.
Despite being frail, he weighed less than 10 stone, and with no archaeological experience, Carnarvon wanted to get permission to dig, which wasn't easy. Private excavators were strictly controlled. But, reluctantly, he was given an area in a place that no one else wanted.
He was given some area at a place called Sheikh El Kerner, which the local inspector, Arthur Vagel, rather described as mounds of rubbish, and probably wouldn't be very exciting for him, and in some ways it wasn't, because after 6 weeks all he found was a large mummified cat coffin, but it was quite a significant object in a way. You can see it in the Curragh Museum today. But it didn't seem to put him off. He thought, well, if I found that after 6 weeks, there's probably more to find elsewhere.
There was more to find elsewhere, but this time the Lord would need expert help, and this was to come from the most opposite of characters. Howard Carter was a quiet, disciplined and dogmatic man of considerable expertise, and the two would bring together a formidable partnership. And despite their personality differences, the two hit it off and became great friends.
Yes, they were friends. I think Carter, it was his life archaeology. They obviously found they just got on well together. Howard Carter didn't have that many close friends. I think he was a bit of a loner, which you'd have to be for working for many years quietly out in the desert, often with great patience and stoicism, and not finding that much. But he was very well suited to the job and was very professional at it.
So the two most unlikely of working partners began digging with their bands of workers in the area known as Det El Bahri. They were making finds, artwork, jewellery, noblemen's tombs. But just a few miles away was the most prestigious place to dig, the royal burial grounds of the Valley of the Kings. A concession to dig here was already won by wealthy American, and some say treasure seeker, Theodore Davis, and he was finding evidence of a mysterious boy king. A faience cup, broken pottery depicting his name, but still no tomb. Meanwhile, Carnarvon and Carter continued to dig, and at the exact site I spoke to Bob Partridge, editor of Ancient Egypt magazine, and asked him what conditions would have been like.
When Carter and Carnarvon started working together, Det El Bahri is a huge site, and when they were working together they actually discovered several private tombs there. The hillside, as you can see, is riddled with tombs. Everywhere you dig you'll encounter one. The houses are built over them. So they uncovered tombs of private individuals which had some funerary equipment left in them. But looking around you now, there's mounds of debris all over the place, and that's where people have dug pits and thrown the debris up to one side and dug another pit. So the site would have been more intact and more wild, if you like, then. To actually know where to dig at any given time is very difficult. Some of the tomb entrances are obvious. You can see the entrances on the hillsides, but others are now buried by scree and previous excavators and treasure hunters.
It's quite striking when you're sitting here amongst all this rubble and rock, and just the other side of the main road, it's very green from the alluvial soil of the delta.
The contrast is dramatic. I mean,
it literally just stops.
It's a straight edge. I mean, and that's, as it's partly man-made, but the River Nile used to flood so far and no further, and you can extend the agricultural land by irrigation, but there comes a point when you're above the water table and you can't do it. What is really interesting here, where we are now, we're on the hillside, we're looking over a modern cemetery. So the area is still used as a cemetery today. So the agricultural land is for the living and the desert is for the dead, but you can literally have 1 foot in the desert and 1 foot on the agricultural land.
The two continued digging for several years, and although they made several smaller finds, there were no great royal treasures. Theodore Davis, meanwhile, continued to dig in the Valley of the Kings, so the two, perhaps a little frustrated, decided for a change and went north, 200 miles north of Cairo and in the Nile Delta at Tel El Balamoon. Tel El Balamoon was a very different place. Flat, dark plains, windswept and lonely. And camping in this desolate landscape, they were often driven back by wild dogs or cobras. Then came the Great War, and with it, the opportunity they needed. Theodore Davis gave up on the Valley of the Kings, believing that there was nothing left to find. It was exhausted. Carnarvon and Carter would take the concession. Overlooking the valley, I asked Bob Partridge why the pharaohs chose to be buried here in the first place.
If you read the books, they always say the valley is very remote, and it does take a long time to drive around there, but a shortcut is over the tops. The reason it was two reasons it was chosen. First of all, it's secure. It's a valley that has one entrance surrounded by high mountains, so you can protect the entrance, you can have guards on the mountain tops. And the sound travels. If you're on the top of the mountains, you can hear people in the valley, so if anyone was digging or making a noise, you can patrol the site, you can hear it. The other reason is probably the Theban peak, the big natural pyramid that dominates the whole site. And pyramids were still quite important. Even the smaller tombs we're sat outside now had pyramids on top of them. But it's thought that the first kings who were buried in the Valley of the Kings chose that site because of this great natural pyramid.
And has the Valley of the Kings always been guarded, always been patrolled since 3,000-4,000 years ago?
It was guarded very well, and when it was guarded, the tombs were intact. But the moment that guard disappears, the place is vulnerable because people will have known how much a value was buried there. And we know from experience that the people sometimes who were robbing the tombs were the very people who were tasked to protect them. So when times get hard, if you know there's valuable objects there, and it hasn't got to be gold. I mean, some of the first robberies in the Valley of the Kings, we know they didn't take the gold, they took the perfumes. So that shows that perfumes were more expensive or more valuable to them than the gold. Second robbery, you take the gold. Third robbery, you take the wooden objects because they can be reused. So once the security in the valley is gone, the robberies just get out of hand. And there comes a point in the Valley of the Kings in particular where the mummies are taken to a safe place and the tombs are just abandoned.
And this is why Tutankhamun is so special, because all the other tombs had been robbed.
Absolutely. Even Tutankhamun's tomb was robbed at least twice. But the first robbers were looking for small portable objects. They were creeping into the tomb. But if that had carried on, the tomb would have been emptied. And you can look at the amount of valuable items there and you can understand why. So that survival is a rare and exceptional discovery.
I walked with the current Lord and Lady Carnarvon into the valley.
What's it like actually being in a valley and imagining what the conditions would have been like for the Fifth Earl?
Well, it's just such a harsh and bleak desert area. It's just so remote, and it must have been such an effort of energy expended in the heat and dust and the rest. I can imagine the determination of Carter and my great-grandfather, really.
You've just been out here for months in these conditions.
Well, Carter practically found a spiritual release in the quiet and peace of the valleys and his thinking of the ancient kings. But I can understand that somehow.
Do you feel much closer to your great-grandfather when you come to a place like this rather than being in Highclere?
Well, I think you can just somehow feel back to the conditions in which he worked. And of course we know where all these things are now, but in some ways when they were working then it was more virgin territory, and where do you begin really?
And when you look across these great valleys and you see mountain after mountain, it literally is trying to find a needle in a haystack. It's amazing how they find these things, isn't it?
I think they used to look at the way the rock fissures work, because that's how the tombs were built into the side of the valley walls. But all the same, it's quite an amazing achievement for him.
Lady Carnarvon, walking up here in your trainers in the heat. This must have been hard working up here.
Working up here,
Yeah.
yes, it must have
Walking's hard enough.
No extraordinary commitment. It's just awesome. Absolutely extraordinary, the size of it all. The size of this valley and the rocks.
And Carnarvon must have thought, well, there's more out there when you look at all these mountains.
I completely agree.
But it could be hundreds of
Optimistic.
pharaohs buried out here. You don't know.
Well, there
do you?
probably are, aren't there?
Yeah, we've only discovered, what, 20? 24, is it?
And you had to bring out all the, the coffees and your refreshments and everything else by donkey. Extraordinary.
What would they have done? Just sat out here in the heat under a shade, having their refreshments, watching the dig? Hundreds of workers
I think
digging?
he helped organise it, actually. So, there's stories of it, he was helping dig up alabaster jars, so he wasn't sitting under a shade, he was very much part of it.
What do you think their friendship was like?
They were good friends, and I think Carnarvon really respected Carter, and Carter respected Carnarvon for what each brought to the job.
For 5 years the two continued to dig, and despite small finds, ornamental works, pottery, there was nothing. Perhaps the valley was indeed exhausted. Now even Carnarvon's enthusiasm and money was running out.
I think he spent towards 50,000 pounds, 50,000 English sterling then.
That's
yes.
a few million today, I
Well,
guess.
I mean, it would have about a few million, but it would have amounted to a pretty hefty amount of money.
Yes.
And I think that's why, by the time the June 1922 had come round and Howard Carter and he had met at Highclere, Lord Carnarvon was at that stage thinking of quitting and saying, that's enough, I had enough with Egypt, this is costing too much and I'm not getting anywhere.
And right at the end, he was literally about to give up, and it was only when Carter offered to fund one final season from his own money that Lord Carnarvon, who's a bit of a gambler, thought, well, if Carter's thinking this, there must be something there, so I'll give it one more season, but no more. And that was the season where the tomb was discovered.
So with just one area to be explored, ironically under some old workmen's huts, Carter began his last dig. And within just 5 days, he discovered steps disappearing downwards, and clearing the earth, this led to a doorway, a still sealed doorway, and over it, in what must have been a heart-stopping moment, the carvings of a tomb. We followed in their footsteps.
Lord Carnarvon, what's it like being outside the tomb of Tutankhamun?
Well, it's a poignant moment. We've seen there's modern steps, but there were the famous rock-cut steps down that Carter found after scrabbling. All the workmen had scrabbled away ancient workmen's rubble from this site, which was the last bit he was going to look at. It was his last triangle before quitting the valley, and that's where they found the tomb.
Is it what you imagined?
The thing that strikes you is how small the area of the tomb is in proportion to the wonderful things that have been taken out of it in the Cairo Museum. Everything was jammed, packed full of extraordinary art, treasures, woodwork, gilded things, gold, the chariots, the beds, the wheels. How Carter got it all out safely is a credit to him. What a tribute to their organisation and, to be honest, engineering skills in getting things out of here, but without damage.
Is it quite an emotional experience coming to a place like this?
It is a very poignant moment. Thinking of this king had lain here undisturbed for towards 3,000 years.
Yes, you can imagine around 80 years ago, Lord Carnarvon, Howard Carter and Eveling outside the other side of this
peering
wall.
through in gloom, they had a little electric torch and of course some candles, and I think the famous canary was put through at some stage to make sure the air was safe to breathe.
It must have been so exciting, wasn't it? Beyond imagination.
Yes, because he was, even having made the discovery of the steps, he was still very worried because it had happened before. There was a famous case a number of years earlier when he'd asked all the dignitaries of Egypt to come and see this tomb opening. There was nothing there on the inside, so he's obviously quite worried that might have happened again.
But they peeked through, and there was that famous line, wasn't it, when Carnarvon was behind Carter, Carter broke a small hole just to
Did you
peer
see
in.
anything? Yes, wonderful things.
Yes. Is that really what he said?
Well, that's what I wasn't there, but I'm sure he did. Yes.
Also at the tomb was a very special guest.
Audrey, what makes this trip so special is you're Audrey Carter, you're related to Howard Carter, and we're standing here outside the entrance to the tomb of Tutankhamun. How does it feel?
Just lovely. It's sort of like meeting an old friend. It's so nice to know that they've managed to leave him in his own tomb, and so that he's peacefully lying there. And the fact that his name is now so well known, it gives him his eternal life. May he live for 1,000,000 years.
That's one of the things that's very special and remarkable about Tutankhamun, in as much as the body's been returned to the tomb, whereas the other pharaohs, of course, a lot of them are sadly on display in the museum as a museum piece.
Yeah.
Now, and you must feel very proud and very connected to this place.
I love coming here, and when I go down into the tomb, I will always offer a little greeting to Tutankhamun to say thank you.
What are you thanking him for? The fame?
Well, the fact that he was found by Howard, and that meant that he would live forever as he so wished.
Is that how it works? That if a pharaoh...
Yes, if they cut out the cartouches or deface the paintings on the walls, it means that their names are lost, and therefore they die a sort of second death, and in effect they're forgotten forever. They never return.
So in some respects, Howard Carter was a saviour for Tutankhamun.
That's right.
That's what the pharaohs believe.
Yes.
Carnarvon and Carter had found a gateway into another world, so far back in time, before Christ, beyond the Romans, before the ancient Greeks. A sophisticated superculture. They could have been from another planet. The tomb might reveal untold knowledge, secrets, new philosophies, and mysteries of the occult. At the time, there was talk about the ethics of entering a tomb and rumours of a curse. What followed was a worldwide press frenzy.
Sort of like, when Princess Diana's funeral, there's this tremendous focus and frenzy throughout the world, wasn't there, on this extraordinary person? There was that point, an extraordinary frenzy and focus on this boy king who was from another civilization which we barely understood, buried intact in his tomb, with, wonders untold and indescribable, which had again been discovered. It feels, reading about it, Lord Carnarvon was just kind of followed everywhere he went. It seemed to attract everybody from sort of taxi drivers in London to, children in Michigan. I think it's been the best running story of the Times or any newspaper ever had. It's sort of, and the minute there's another possible discovery, it rises straight to the surface. There's some sort of magic which draws people back, I think.
Carnarvon surprised everyone with how media savvy he was. He sold exclusive press rights with the Times, photographic franchises, and even talked about film documentaries with the Pathé people. Meanwhile, the methodical Carter was harassed on site by the press and hordes of visitors. His slow, disciplined approach with teams of botanists, scientists and chemists, bringing out objects one at a time, sometimes over a period of weeks, was much to their frustration. Bob Partridge.
Carter was very methodical with this. Each object was recorded, photographed in situ, drawn, and then taken out one at a time. Removing the objects wasn't that easy because they were heaped one on top of the other, so they had to be moved very carefully. The antechamber was actually cleared before the burial chamber was formally entered. Clearing the tomb took 10 years, a huge timescale in any excavation, which shows how methodical Carter was. Earlier excavations, and indeed later ones, have been cleared almost with unseemly haste.
Carter wanted to be left in peace to get on with the proper scholarly work of uncovering this amazing discovery. And of course, what actually happened was he was pestered day and night by visitors and the press wanting ever-ending new reports, and I think he found that quite difficult, which made him therefore not a great communicator with the outside world and quite short-tempered, and things did reach some sad arguments.
With the Times having exclusive rights to information, other newspapers felt that they were getting second-hand news. Arguments ensued too about ownership and control of the tomb. Exhausted, Lord Carnarvon went on a short break, sailing to Aswan, a trip in which he was bitten on the side of his cheek by a mosquito.
I think he found it all rather too much suddenly. He tried to go to rest for a few days down at Aspran. He did get bitten by this mosquito, which he didn't really look after this cut. He cut it shaving and then didn't look after the wound very well. People with a stronger immune system may well have shaken that kind of thing off, but his was obviously impaired. It's also said that, of course, he breathed in dust from the ancient tomb, and that might have been hostile to him as well. But I think it's actually because he'd had fairly serious injuries. He was quite light, quite frail, getting very tired.
Yes, yeah.
Massive stress about the whole thing, and then he goes and gets a nasty infection, which sadly gets in his bloodstream. And of course, it was just too early for antibiotics. I think Alexander Fleming may well have been discovering penicillin at the same time, but it was too early for my great-grandfather.
Lord Carnarvon was brought to the Continental Savoy Hotel in central Cairo, and on the upper floors of the hotel, with pneumonia setting in, it's said he uttered the words, "I have heard the call, I am preparing." His wife Almina flew from England to be at his side, but at 2 in the morning on the 5th of April 1923, with his family, Lord Carnarvon passed away. Immediately it's said that the lights went out across the city, and the Earl's favourite terrier back home at Highclere at that exact moment pined and died. And whether you believe this or not, the truth is that 5 months and a day after the discovery of the tomb of Tutankhamun, Lord Carnarvon had gone.
My grandfather was a bit superstitious of the events of his father's death, really. The few items that Carter left at Highclere, most of the small ones, my grandfather shut up between two of our rooms, which is in the two of the bigger rooms on the ground floor, between the drawing room and the smoking room. He'd put furniture on either side of the double doors, and these items sat in this dark space for some 64 years until we discovered them in 1988, a few months after he died.
You think they were hidden away because
he didn't want to talk about them.
So Carter would continue to remove the contents of the tomb, a process that he wouldn't finish for another 10 years. Carter eventually faded into obscurity, with few friends or relatives, and died alone in 1939 in England of Hodgkin's disease. Even his simple gravestone had no mention of his discoveries until it was changed recently. And memories of Lord Carnarvon?
I think one of the things you have to remember about him was Tutankhamun was the most spectacular find ever, but that was in 1922, and he's starting in 1907. And how many of us would have persisted in such a quest for quite so long?
It's very sad that he never really saw the full contents of the tomb.
No, it's
come out.
completely sad. He didn't see all the sarcophagi being taken out and the internal coffins and the mask and that side.
So he never even saw the mask or all those great things.
No, and that was a great sadness. But I suppose on his deathbed, he had achieved the one thing he was after for many years, which was to make a fabulous discovery in Egypt, and he'd achieved that.
And the man's legacy? Lady Carnarvon.
He certainly realised he had made one of the most important discoveries ever made in archaeology, which it is. It's still the key thing which school children learn about. It's still a sort of Indiana Jones story, isn't it? And Lord Carnarvon and his wonderful hats and sort of dashing figure.
It's very sad as well when you think that this man had a great love for Egypt, a great passion for Egypt, obviously, and in the end Egypt in a way killed him, didn't it?
It did. I don't know how many men are killed by their passions. I think probably quite a lot are, because you don't stop when you should do. But I think it's wonderful to have such a passion, isn't it? To find something which completely takes you over. And this would have been his last season, I'm sure. He also sort of marks the time when private excavation in Egypt and most other countries ceased. He was the last great private excavator, and thereafter it's passed to universities or to the Council of Antiquities in Egypt. So it's the end of that sort of era, really.